Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and thank you for joining me for another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the year 1981, another great year for music that saw the continuation of so many different styles that had started to be developed in the years prior, as well as the continued advancement in technology. And this is a year that produced so many incredible records. And I gotta say, this was actually a really hard year for me to narrow down to 5 albums. It took a lot of thinking and a lot of re-listening to different records, and I was really amazed at how many gems of albums came out of this year, and I think it really illustrates how much exciting things were on the horizon and how much change was happening in music in this early part of the 80s. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums of 1981, starting with number 5. Okay, coming in at number 5 is The Visitors by ABBA. At the time that this was recorded, this was initially meant to be ABBA's final studio album, but they would eventually do a reunion album in 2021. But at this point in their discography, this was the final studio album that they were planning to put out, and I think they did a really fantastic job all throughout this. On this one, they changed gears a bit from what they had done on a lot of their previous records, and the overall mood on this one shifts a little bit, and the types of subject matters that they would write about also shifts into some different territories. At this point, both couples in the group have divorced, and because of that, the mood of this album is a little bit more on the darker side, as well as being more introspective from a lyrical perspective, with lots of different subject matters being covered from song to song, ranging from the divorce to reflecting on getting older, and politics and war, and just a lot of subject matters that they wouldn't really talk about in any of their previous records. The album is 9 tracks long, with 4 songs on side 1 and 5 songs on side 2. For side 1, it's hard for me to narrow down one favorite track because I do think tracks 2 through 4 is pretty much a perfect succession of songs, with Head Over Heels, When All Is Said and Done, and Soldiers. All 3 of those I would regard as exceptional ABBA songs. For side 2, my favorite track would have to be Slipping Through My Fingers, which is a beautiful song about getting older as a parent and watching your child grow up. My other favorites on this side would have to be One of Us and 2 for the Price of One. And of all of the ABBA songs that have male vocals on it, 2 for the Price of One would have to be my favorite. And we hadn't really heard very much male vocals since the earlier part of the ABBA discography, and I really like how they brought that back for this final record. So I think at this point in their career, with all of the turmoil in their personal lives, I think they managed to take that stuff and use it as inspiration to produce a very high quality and very mature sounding album that I think is very unique within the ABBA discography. And for its original intentions as being the final ABBA record, I do not think they could have gone out on a better album. And when we're talking ABBA's full discography, this one goes down as my second favorite album of their entire studio discography. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on ABBA's studio discography, I did a video ranking all of their albums, so be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist, which is linked in the comments and the description if you are interested. But yeah, I cannot say enough good things about this record. I think it produced a handful of some of the best ABBA songs of their discography, and for the way this album was originally intended to be, I do not think they could have gone out on a better album. So that is my number 5 album. Now on to number 4. Okay, coming in at number 4 is Nonstop Erotic Cabaret by Soft Cell. This was the debut studio album to come from this very influential synth-pop duo, and I think this record is the perfect introduction to the very unique sounds of Mark Almond and Dave Ball. They recorded this in New York City, and at that time, in the early 80s in the city, a lot of the nightlife had revolved around nightclubs and drug use, and a lot of that would influence the writing on this record. Lyrically, there's a lot of sleazy subject matter being covered, and that's something that Soft Cell has always been well known for, but in addition to that, there's also a couple of very deep and reflective tracks on here, tackling a variety of different subject matters that all seem to relate back to the human condition. It's 10 tracks long, and the most noteworthy song to come from this record would be Tainted Love, which is by far Soft Cell's most popular song, and an incredible track from this record. And a little fun fact about that song that a lot of people are not aware of is that it's actually a cover song. It's not an original of theirs. So when I found that out, I was pretty surprised to hear that. The other 2 singles to come from this record are Say Hello, Wave Goodbye, and Bedsitter. all of which are amazing tracks. And one thing that I love about Soft Cell and their writing on this record is that it contains all of those dance and electronic elements that would give you that nightclub sort of vibe, but there's also a couple of tracks on here that have a serious dark edge to them and go into some much more mysterious and ominous territories on tracks like Youth and Entertain Me. Those would be my two favorite songs from this record, and I always really resonate with the more dark side of Soft Cell's writing, and that's an element of their sound that I think is pretty unique to them, and I think it really separated them from a lot of the other synth pop groups at that time, and they were always a daring group that was never afraid to write about subject matters that may have been considered taboo at that time, and I think that rebellious and daring nature, combined with their very unique musical sensibilities, resulted in one of the most unique synth pop albums to come out of the 80s. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on Soft Cell's full discography, I did a video ranking all of their studio albums. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 4 album of 1981. Now on to number 3. Coming in at number 3 is Juju by Susie and the Banshees. This is a very cool record to come from this British post-punk and alt-rock group, and I really love the stylistic territories that they chose to go in on this record, taking a detour from their previous few albums and going into some much darker territories with this amazing fusion of their core post-punk elements, as well as gothic rock, psychedelic rock, art rock, and some dream pop elements on certain songs as well, especially in the guitar parts. I really love the way the guitars are recorded throughout this record, and I think the production is incredible. And this fusion and exploration of different styles against this dark backdrop that sort of encapsulates the entire record resulted in what I think is the best record of the Susie and the Banshees discography. It's 9 tracks long with 5 songs on side 1 and 4 songs on side 2. And I love both sides of this record, but I think side 1 is really where a lot of the magic is happening. All 3 of my favorite songs on this record happen on side 1, with the tracks Spellbound, Into the Light, and Monitor. Side 2 gets a little moodier and spacier, with more experimental elements popping up from track to track. And I love this change of pace, and I think it contrasts side 1 so nicely. And I think it resulted in an album that is very enjoyable from front to back, with all sorts of different stylistic dabblings, and all the best sounds and styles that Susie and the Banshees have explored up to that point. Of all of their records, this one would contain the largest amount of my favorite songs by them, and I think it's just a very cool and very dark record to come out of the year 1981. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Tin Drum by Japan. This was the final record from Japan's studio discography, and at this point they had really been on a roll with their past couple of records, with so many new developments and evolutions happening within their sound, and just overall very high quality and very tasteful songwriting. And this album is the perfect conclusion to that run of very unique and very awesome records. Stylistically, this album is a fusion of a lot of different worlds, ranging from art pop to synth pop to avant pop to new wave, and they're also starting to introduce some more Eastern influences throughout this record due to David Sylvian's fascination with Eastern culture. The album is 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side, and these tracks offer up the best sounds that Japan has to offer, with some top-notch experimental pop tracks like The Art of Parties, Talking Drum, Still Life and Mobile Homes, and Visions of China. All of these tracks groove super hard, but also have so much interesting stuff going on between all of the different synth sounds, the exotic and unorthodox layers of sounds on top of one another, as well as the seriously groovy bass lines from Mick Karn, who I've said in previous videos I think is one of the most underrated and tasteful bass players to come out of the late 70s and the 80s. And we also have a couple of tracks that really capture that Eastern influence with Canton and the closer, Cantonese Boy. And then we have 2 other tracks that veer off into some different territories, but I think completely tie the entire record together, with the tracks Ghosts and Sons of Pioneers. Ghosts would be my all-time favorite Japan ballad. Such a beautiful and dreamy song that puts you into a completely different world, and in my opinion is an example of David Sylvian operating at his compositional peak. And Sons of Pioneers is a very dark and ominous track that's centered around the bass, and in my opinion sounds like a track that could be on a Mick Karn solo album, so I love the addition of that track to this record as well. And I think within all 8 of these tracks, we are seeing all of the best sides of Japan, and we're really hearing each individual instrumentalist and songwriter shine at their very brightest. And I think Japan concluded their studio discography at the top of their game. And if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on Japan's full discography, I did a video ranking all of their studio albums, so if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 2 album, and now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1981. Alright, coming in as my favorite album of 1981 is Healing by Todd Rundgren. Unless you're a big Todd Rundgren fan, there's a likely chance that you've never heard of this record before, and I think this is one of the unsung heroes of Todd Rundgren's discography. He's recorded almost 30 studio albums to date, all of which I have listened to, and of all of those records, this one goes down as my second favorite album of his entire discography. And this was the first album to really introduce us to the more electronic side of Todd Rundgren, and it's fused together beautifully with awesome piano and guitar parts. Todd is in the driver's seat for the entirety of this record, playing all of the instruments, doing the production and the engineering all by himself, and the album gives us a really nice blend of different moods throughout these tracks, but it's all centered around this general message of spirituality and the human condition, and the idea of there being some sort of figure that has the power to heal the world, and wrestling with the question of whether or not that would be a good thing to be able to have that sort of power. And the album is 9 tracks long, with 6 songs on side 1 and then 3 longer songs on side 2, which are a continuation of one another. For side 1, my 2 favorite tracks would have to be Compassion and the opening track Healer, which I think kickstarts the album absolutely beautifully. Side 2 gives us a track that is divided up into 3 parts, which is titled Healing, and this side of the album really starts to take us into some beautiful and euphoric territories. Healing Part 1 kickstarts things really nicely and gets us established into this chill and vibey sort of groove with really tasteful synth parts going on and beautiful vocal melodies with great lyrical content about mindfulness and trying to find something to keep you centered in the moment. And Todd is instructing the listener to try to meditate on his voice and just find something to kind of concentrate on and keep yourself grounded. And that kickstarts things really nicely. And then when it goes into Healing Part 2, you just get washed away into this very dreamy and euphoric atmosphere. And I think the way that these 2 tracks work off of one another and set up the meditative sort of atmosphere that you get on Part 2 is just absolutely perfect. And then Healing Part 3 is like a more upbeat version of Healing Part 1 and brings the energy back up, and by the end of side 2 of this record, you just feel completely restored and refreshed. And I think the concept and the execution behind this record was just done in an absolutely fabulous way on Todd Rundgren's part, and the fact that he's doing all of the instruments and all of the engineering and production on his own makes it even that much more impressive. And if you've been following this channel for any period of time, you might know that I am a huge Todd Rundgren fan. He's one of my favorite songwriters, and I did a video ranking all of his studio albums as well, so if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. But that is my number 1 favorite album of 1981. So to recap, at number 5, we had The Visitors by ABBA. At number 4, we had Nonstop Erotic Cabaret by Soft Cell. At number 3, we had Juju by Susie and the Banshees. At number 2, we had Tin Drum by Japan, and now at number 1, we have Healing by Todd Rundgren. Thank you so much for listening, and if you haven't heard any of these albums and you check them out, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear what you think, and please feel free to let me know what your top 5 favorite albums of 1981 are in the comments. I would love to see your lists. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1982. I'll see you then. Take care.